So welcome all to this panel, a Saturday panel of modern literature. I'm Filippo Cervelli, co-convening the section with Nozomi Uematsu, and I'll be chairing this session. So as you may know from the chat and other messages, unfortunately, Keith Vincent will not participate in this panel because of time differences and other things that came up. So our first speaker will be Miho Takahashi, who studied at Kansai University in Osaka and at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And she has been working for Kansai University since she completed her PhD. She is currently professor of English at Kansai University, as well as a member of the Institute of Oriental and Occidental Studies there. Her publications include The Image of None, Browning, Rossetti, and Hopkins, that came out in 2011, and The Reception and Adaptation of English Romanticism in Modern Japanese Literature, 2018, and The Recurrence of English Literature, edited, came out in 2021. So without further ado, Miho-san, I will leave the floor to you for your presentation. I would just like to specify for the general audience that we will have the two presentations and a QA section at the end. So if you have questions, please write them in the Zoom chat or just raise your hand at the Q&A session and we can enjoy a lively discussion. The meeting will be recorded, and thank you very much. Miho-san,
Filippo-san, thank you very much for your kind introduction. This presentation, I'd like to introduce and examine the centenary process of where European sonnets have been received by Japanese readers in Meiji era and adapted to Japanese verse and developed into Japanese sonnets. First, let me summarize sonnet in general. The origin of sonnet can be traced back to Sicily, Italy in the 13th century. Sonnet is shortest fixed verse in European literature, consisting of 14 lines with strict prosody. A general understanding, sonnet is thought to correspond to Japanese waka and haiku, often written in sequence rather than written as a single piece. Similar to haiku, sonnet is short and compressed. Besides, in the respect of social role, sonnet is similar to waka in the process of developing from personal love story to court poet and eventually to religious poetry. In short, sonnet could be considered to be closer to waka in a broad sense.
Miho-san, you're muted. Oh, okay.
Sonnet came to Japan for the first time in Meiji era through the translation. There are quite a few 14-line poems in the translated verses, for example, Ueda Bin's Kaijoon, Nagai Kafu's Sangoshu, Horiguchi Daikaku's Gekkan no Ichigun, and so on. However, those translated works were not directly imported from Italian sonnets, but through the influence of the works of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, an Italian-English painter and poet. Due to Ueda Bin's essay in 1895, Rossetti became popular in Japanese literary world. Dante Gabriel Rossetti was a son of an exiled Italian. His father was a famous Dantean scholar. He formed a group of young artists called Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in the Victorian era. This group was founded mainly by young and promising painters and poets. They were against the industrialization and materialism, yearning for medievalism, and looking for the simplicity in art and lifestyle. One of his famous sonnets, The Blessed Damsel, has been translated by many Japanese poets. Now let us look at that piece, The Blessed Damsel. Here are the opening 6 lines. To summarize the features, I would pick up the simplicity in sound, rhythm, and vocabulary. And this work is attached to Dante Gabriel's painting under the same title. And it's a very good example of the integration of poetry and painting. The poet is striving for the precisely detailed visual depiction in painting, while his sonnets are written in monosyllabic words with simple vocabulary. Selection of alliteration are suppressed to heighten the sound effect further. In short, written in simple language, the poem sounds more powerful and more impressive and very pictorial, yet passionate in an Italian way, full of unique beauty. And this sonnet shows the significant idea of sister art, that means collaboration of painting and poetry. Strongly influenced by Rossetti and his work, Susukida Kyukin was the first writer of Japanese sonnet in the Japanese literary history. Kyukin called his own sonnet Zekku, and his collection named Botekishu. This book became so well received, and the first edition sold out, 5,000 copies was sold out in less than 2 months. Let's have a look on a sonnet by him titled Korogi. This early sonnet has no stanza, thoroughly 14 lines. And Keats was loved by Rossetti and also his pre-Raphaelite members, and also in Japan at that time. And Kyukin make the paragraphs, stanzas later in Koinoya. This is an Italian style, 4 lines, and 3 and 3, after the style of Rossetti. The most interesting is the rhythm of each line. Let's have a look on the first stanza. Each line has 4 3 numbered syllables, and which look like a kind of micro rhyme scheme of Italian sonnets. And Kyukin was followed by his friend Kambara Ariake. He arranged the rhymes more effectively, both in versification and in vocabulary. In some way, he completed Japanese sonnets. He started writing sonnets after 1907. Ariake used to have his own rhythm called Dokugen Aikacho. However, he moved from this Dokugen Aikacho onto new rhythm. Ariake translated European sonnets into Japanese, and through the experience of translating the sonnets, he published a collection titled Ariake-shu. This book was also well received with a great reputation. And Kyukin, the father of the Japanese sonnets, left all his achievement to Ariake and retired and never returned to sonnets. Later, Ariake was called Japanese Rossetti or magician of meter. Let's have a look on a sonnet by Ariake titled Matsurika. And I'd like to quote the first quatrain to explain the rhythm. Here, we could find the new rhythm, 757 or 575, what is called Kogocho alternate rhythm. Ariake tried to apply the rhythm of waka into that of his sonnet. And Ishikawa Takuboku was also influenced by Rossetti and made some sonnets. For example, in 1904, Takuboku wrote Ogon Genkyo, and it has an interesting rhythm. Number of syllables is 4, 4, 4, 6, and this is called. This could be called as Takuboku's own sonnet style and rhythm. On the other hand, there is another movement influenced by French sonnets and challenging to apply European meter to Japanese sonnets. Iwano Homei once wrote Italian-styled Rossetti-like sonnets and called his sonnet Tankyoku. He moved on to French symbolist poetry, and if we look at one of his French-influenced poems, we could find a strong admiration for Satanism, kind of akumashugi. he wrote an experimental piece titled Noroi. This sonnet is written in 4 lines, 4 lines, 4 lines, and 2 lines. And each line has 334 numbered syllables. And curiously enough, Homei tried to write a Japanese sonnet in a rhyme scheme as shown in the underlined part. And let me here each second たまたまそのたまその身を命を縮まん呪わん憧れいくなれ He's trying to make a kind of pseudo rhyming what I would call. And this idea was followed by Nakahara Chuya. He made a new movement of Japanese sonnets, also influenced by French symbolist sonnets. Chuya wrote 14th-rhymed poems with slightly devised ending rhymes, trying to follow European sonnet convention in colloquial New Japanese. Here, let's have a look on Hitotsu no Meruhen. This is also four stanzas, 4 lines, 4 lines, and 3 and 3. And here, repetition creates an echo, and pseudo-rhyming creates the ending rhythm of each stanza. And focusing each line, the number of syllables is not strictly fixed. But there is some sort of rhythm running through. If I compare to English sonnet, I could say it's as if it were written in blank verse. And Tachihara Michizo, Chuya's close friend, was also influenced by German poet Rilke and other European poets through the experience of translation. And let's have a look on his sonnet, Asaki Haru ni Yosete, to early spring. And if we read aloud, we might notice that heavy repetition creates a harmony, and which culminates in musicality in the end. This poem is actually accompanied by several musical settings. His sonnets have been set to music by various composers, and Tachihara's life was too short, unfortunately, yet his brilliant works indicate a peculiar, experimental, yet unique form of verse, and are still attractive to us and to younger generation. Then, in 1942, during World War II, a group of young Japanese poets, including Kato Shuichi, Fukunaga Takehiko, and Nakamura Shinichiro, and so on, started Machine poetic movement, influenced by French poets and poetics. Their poetical experiments culminated in an aesthetic completeness of musicality in Japanese sonnets. Shall we have a look, for example, Sakurai Yokocho by Kato Shuichi. Each line has 5 7-numbered syllables, and there is volta here, and there's rhythm is changed here into 7+4. The most important experiment is rhyming and rhyming. We could find a clear rhyme scheme here: A B B A B A A B B A A B A B in Japanese. But this movement was short-lived, finished in 1950 because Miyoshi Tatsuji strongly criticized movement in 1948. Miyoshi believed that Japanese language wouldn't fit the European versification. He regards rhyming impossible for Japanese language because the number of vowels is limited, only 5, and general pronunciation of the language sounds plain and dull. The number of verbs and the inflection of verbs are also limited, which doesn't have enough variety for sonnet making compared with the case of European language and Chinese. And I myself also noticed that during the preparing this presentation, rhyming in Japanese sonnet is too dependent on the inflection of the verbs. Yet I'd like to reconstruct the true appreciation of this experiment in versification, as we have seen, and especially when we consider musicality of poetry. After this movement was over, our contemporary sonneteer turned up. Tanikawa Shuntaro wrote almost 100 sonnets, and when he was young, and then first published in 1953 as 62 sonnets. And recently, this sonnet sequence was newly reprinted together with the unpublished 36 sonnets and translated into English in 2009. Interesting enough, or coincidentally, Japanese sonnets started from translation and mimic of European sonnets, and a century later, this movement is somehow concluded with the English translation of Tanikawa's Japanese sonnets in his own style. I'd like to show you a bilingual text here. The title is Today. This is free verse, both in the original and the translation. Here, repetition creates echoes and harmony. In English translation, pseudo-rhyme is made of repeated words such as today, again, next, only today, yet faithful to the original. And as a conclusion, looking through all the attempts and experiments that Japanese modern poets have done for more than a century, I'd like to suggest some future possibility of Japanese sonnets. It is true that rhyming in Japanese sonnet is too dependent on the inflection of verbs. Then, thinking of a variety of rhyme, it can't be equivalent to European sonnets. Yet, I'd like to emphasize that this experiment of Japanese sonnets leads to fruitful result of musical collaboration. In the same way as traditional Italian sonnets and other traditional European sonnets were sung in tune. Among the Japanese sonnets, Tachiharas are most popular as song. And there's even a J-pop styled setting by a young composer Fujimiya-san. And the work of a Machine poetic group too, as seen the example of Sakura Yokocho, it's attracted modern composers for settings. So in short, the musicality of fixed verse is appreciated and invites musical setting to the poems. This correspondence of sister arts, that is poetry and music, might be one of the future possibilities and would be possible way of reappreciating Japanese sonnet. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miho-san, for a very interesting and insightful presentation, and yeah, on point also with the time and concise. That is really appreciated. So I will move now to our second speaker, Wakako Taneda. I'll bring up the bio now. So, okay, so Wakako Taneda is professor at Fuji Women's University in Sapporo, in Hokkaido. She has majored in Japanese modern Japanese literature, focusing on Izumi Kyoka, Nakagami Kenji, and the writings of Takahashi Takako. She completed her PhD in 2012 with the thesis on Izumi Kyoka. She has been studying recently Ito Hiromi for a few years, and concerning this research on the poet Ito Hiromi, she published an article titled "Weaving a Different World: The Attic Picture Books and the Narrating Voice," which was published in 2019. So Taneda Sensei, I will leave the floor to you with your presentation on voices in the poetry of Ito Hiromi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Can I share the screen? It's okay?
Yes, we can see it, yes.
Thank you. Ito Hiromi as a transfer, leaving other voices. Today, I'm going to talk about Ito Hiromi's Togenuki Shinsugamo Jizo Engi. The Togenuki in English title is The Zone Pure New Tales of Sugamo Jizo. This work won the Hagiwara Sakutaro Prize following the 18th Murasaki Shikibu Prize. First of all, I'll summarize the long abstracts which I have read, including some new points of view. Secondly, I refer to the narrator I. After that comes the issue of quotation, mimicry, and subject. Then I'll focus on the factor of plants and animals. Lastly, I would like to go into the heart of Ito's work, or to put it another way, I will attempt to redefine the location of Ito Hiromi. Firstly, it is important to note that Ito is a moving poet and also novelist. Likewise, the narrator in Togenuki, I divided her time between Kumamoto Prefecture and California to provide elderly care. She travels a lot, not only for the care of her parents, but also for her own work. Her enthusiastic affinity with Sekyo shows that Ito has a mental connection with the moving entertainers of the people of the past. In Togenuki, Ito tried to bring to the foreground a modern tale, Oguri, which has been popular for a long time. However, the structure of Togenuki is not simple, being weaved from a wide range of texts and authors. We may say that Ito's text belongs to the category of mosaic citation, in other words, intertextuality. In addition, her style is characterized by sympathy to others' voices. That is to say, Ito becomes the resonator of the voice of others. Each time the narrator moves, her words are transformed. I'd like to investigate Ito's stance as a transfer and metamorphosis. Tochiki Nobuaki has already stated this point of view in terms of the translator in respect to Kawara Alexa. Furthermore, I need to redefine trans, and this is related to defining the category of Ito's katarimono. Finally, this should lead us to the location of Ito. So let's begin by asking question, who is narrator I? The narrator's language has been constructed as a multi-dimensional language. For example, she is usually the translator, but at the same time, she has been translated by her family. She sometimes directly translates using Japanese to English word order when communicating with her Jewish British husband, while her mother speaks in Tokyo dialect, and her children talk in Japanese English Creole. In chapter 2, being taken by mother from the Iwanosaka to Sugamo, where I speaks of her grandmother's divine possession through the story of her morbid mother, clearly expressing her affinity for the Tokyo dialect. In this chapter, she narrates the route of faith to Togenuki through the biography of her grandmother, her mother, and her aunt. They all believe Togenuki Jizo's benefit. In this chapter, the narrator changes her pronunciation into Tokyo dialect, especially the blended sound he and the sound she. Her name is Hiromi, but the elder women in her family pronounce it Shiromi. The narrator overlaps with Ito herself. This work is narrated in the first person, but it does not belong to the conventional Japanese I novel because the narrator is changing her narrative dimension each chapter. Kamei Hideo pointed out that man's narrative belongs to I novel, Waregatari, which dominates the narrative in modern literature. As a result, woman's Iegatari was absorbed by Waregatari. As an example of Iegatari is Ie by Shimasaki Toson, 1910. Kamei said Otane is a protagonist. One of protagonists is called Ie Toji in the novel. And also she is the narrator of the old family's roots. We may find that there are other novels in this genre of Iegatari. We can recall other novels such as Kinokawa, Bonchi, and Nichirin no Tsubasa, and so on. Ito's Togenuki may belong to this Iegatari genre and construct a new tale with the tradition of Tokyo dialect. The narrator's mother and grandmother moved from Shitaya Ryusenji-cho to Iwanosaka in Itabashiku, keeping their Tokyo dialect in the meantime. At present, while her mother is moving from hospital to hospital, suffering from illness such as Alzheimer's and skin disease, she communicates to her daughter in Tokyo dialect. The narrator strongly impresses the characteristics of maternal genealogy through the Tokyo dialect. Furthermore, in chapter 9, Ito wrote that long years ago, I learned the sound he is Tokyo dialect pronunciation. If you have to write as a character, it is represented by su in the linguistic class. The central problem of this episode is cultural differences. Going back to Ito's 18th poem, Su-ko on Su, Ito narrated that only women of a particular old generation in Tokyo can hear and understand the sound Su. Consequently, it caused the loss of this phonological element. Concerning Suko, Tsuboi Hideto states that the narrator is the last tradition of matriarchal lineage, but she has failed to do so, and she has also been transplanted with discomfort for the matriarchy. According to Tsuboi, the fact that the narrator makes the sound Su oppose a system of cultural difference. Tsuboi used an analogy of a process by which a hybrid plant species destroys a pure species plant. Tsuboi recognized that it has complex factors in her inner surface, in that she can distinguish the sound Su, but nonetheless she cannot pronounce Su. Around 15 years later, she married a Jewish Englishman. This influenced Ito's change in consciousness of language. In Togenuki chapter 9, the narrator notes she tried to transport the correct pronunciation of her name to her husband. As a result, her husband pronounces Hiromi similarly as Shiromi because he learned the non-stressed Hiromi from his wife. Consequently, his pronunciation says flatly Hiromi, and then the sound he got closer to the sound Su. Interestingly, the sound Su was transplanted to her husband. In Togenuki, this sound Su is not a pure species. It can spread to others' tongues. But her husband cannot always pronounce the sound Su. When he gets angry, the sound Su disappears. As we can see in chapter 4, the narrator illustrates the cultural difference between the narrator and her husband through a humorous episode concerning translation of Japanese food name. Her husband didn't try to learn the Japanese word hakusai for 10 years while living with her. The narrator said, so by the time we got to the hakusai, I was already full of despair. we'd been living together for 10 years, but for fact, in a decade, he couldn't learn a simple Japanese word like hakusai. Like hakusai. Okay. However, the program of cultural difference is not limited to only this episode. As I said at the beginning, it was movement poet and also novelist. However, her movement encompasses more than just crossing beyond the visible boundary. It is a risky choice concerning language. Nobody could say whether a single accent or a single pronunciation can instantly become a link in a relationship or not, whether it guarantees identity or not. Now, I would like to move on to look at constructing narrative through the use of quotation, mimicry, and subject. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, the narrator usually sticks to the sounds and friction occurs with her husband concerning communication. All the same, the narrator does not take a privileged role, waregatari, because togenuki is followed by sekyobushi, which has been narrated with many kinds of variants. What should be remembered is that the narrator keeps her viewpoint through two opposite orientations, such as constructing and deconstructing. As an illustration, the narrator cites the Japanese fairy tale, Kojiki, Franz Kafka, and so on. On the other hand, she narrates being absorbed in them. In essence, the narrator's behavior is mimicry. It has the same meaning as metamorphosis. The following sentences demonstrate mimicry. Number 1. My husband, who was watching the catch, admired my ability for catching rats. He said, "How many rats did you catch alive? What an amazing ability you have. Although you have a neck pain, your talent of catching rats has not been lost yet. You pretend to be a woman, but isn't your identity a cat?" On February 24, I went back to Japan. I was alone this time, just before I left. I beat my husband. Yes, you read that right. I beat him. I beat bite too. I was so frustrated, I didn't know what I was doing. I'd lost the ability to act like a normal human being. By the way, when talking about the sparrow with its tongue cut, the old man who got rid of his lamp follows. My husband got lamp. Number 4, since that day, I have been watching my husband unconsciously, as if I was the old woman who lives with the old man with a lamp. I should have thought about the possibility that my husband is not a good dancer, like the old next door. From these episodes, which are related to Japanese classical stories, it is clear that the narrator and her husband pretended to be other protagonists, and the narrator emphasizes the uncertainty of being human. The narrator uses metaphors such as peach, cat, and lamp to create context, and they lead us into the narrative world. In other words, I has controls the tale. On the other hand, I and others are summoned to the world of storytelling. The narrator as a subject changes into its object briefly. Also, the narrator could quote from many kinds of stories. Loses her balance. This trend also extends to the family. Honestly speaking, each family member doesn't live a normal social life. If we reveal our true nature, where each is a monsters or foxes. Moreover, Ito's citation is characterized as a unique approach. Tochiki Nobuaki point out a multi-layered composition from Togenuki in chapter 15. Ito traced Bacchus the Believer and combines the poem of Arjuro Rambo, and finally relates these to Oguri. Tochiki calls it millefeuille structure. Ito's way of not only transposing Dazai's works, but also echoing the voices of the Greek classics is most characteristic of her text. She presses them to the present instead of returning to the original. There is one other thing is important concerning Togenuki. I refer to the factor of plants and animals. It is well known that it is obsessed with plant. She has written an epic and some novels and essays in which plants are taken as the subject matter, such as Kawara Alexa, Houseplant, and Kodama Kusadam. I will not take up these works in detail. Rather, I will limit the consideration to Togenuki. In chapter 8, the narrator watches Kazura and describes the plant nature as the amazing chaos. It's regarded the forcing Kazura as if it was a state of all living things. This insight has a deep connection. This insight is a deep connection with chapter 9. The narrator meets a gardener who says memento mori. They hit it off together through their view of life and death. The gardener doesn't consider the death of the plant to be its death. The narrator and the gardener are chanting that the plant don't die like human beings. We don't need to care about the withering of the plant. Ito has a vision of the gardener going to Portalaga while growing Portulaga. They share their view of impermanence by entrusting it to plant. I think that their affinity with plant is a good example to illustrate Iegatari that we have seen, because women's Iegatari does not assert individuality, and it's split into branches and leaves, indeed, rambling narratives. But it has a fertility in the world of storytelling. On the contrary, Waregatari belongs to the category of animals, because it's a narrative that sticks to the individual. As a whole, Togenuki is a narrative that is created through repeated vegetative transplantation. Okay, to sum up what I have talked about, I have analyzed Ito's Togenuki through three aspects. For one, there is transplantation of an accent through one as a metamorphosis from human beings to animals or other living things, in the style of Japanese classical literature. And lastly, the consideration of notion that the narrative connects its own. But Ito is locked in the individual body, as all humans are. Togenuki is constructed by flexible quotation, as has been pointed out. At the same time, it emphasizes the pain of having a body that is not free. We have to live out our lives as living beings. Thus, we can define Togenuki as a text in which the structure is an amalgamation of vegetable and animal factors. The narrator's movement in Togenuki demonstrates the boundaries of Ito's location. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Taneda Sensei, for the very interesting presentation. I think it's really good for the balance and purposes of the whole section to have a session that is dedicated to poetry. So that was very interesting, and also bordering on modern and contemporary literature. I would like to leave the floor to questions. So as I mentioned, you can either write them in the Zoom chat or just use the raise your hand function in Zoom, and then we'll get to you. I see we already have one from Irina. This is addressed to Miho Takahashi. Thank you for the overview and the evolution of sonnets form in modern Japanese poetry. The question is, did Japanese sonnets carry over any of the themes present in the original traditions they were based on, Italian, French, English, or did they come up with any new topics that are specifically Japanese?
Thank you for Irina-san. I would say symbolism is the most influential topic from European literature in Japanese, modern Japanese. For example, rose or mermaid or some legendary like Greek or European legendary characters. It's quite, they are the really new idea and topic and themes to Japanese writers. And through Ueda Bean's translation, they started digging those new topics and themes by themselves through translation or translating the poetry by themselves. And then finally, like Manfred by Ogai, and through Manfred, they went to Byron, and they went to some symbolist French writers, and then making some sort of aesthetic value, new aesthetic value in their works. And then, especially nature, the way you look at nature, I think it has changed as a time. And then, in addition, I would say, what they call correspondence. It means we have 5 senses, but we use 5 senses together sometimes, like the color, we could feel color when hear some sound. This kind of a new sensitivity. This is also influenced later in Japanese literature. Thank you very much.
So while we wait for other questions to come up, I would just like to follow up on a question to Miho-san. So I'm not an expert on poetry, but since you mentioned Tanikawa Shuntaro, I know that he is very good friends with an author I've worked on, Takahashi Genichiro, who is also good friends with Fujii Sadakazu. And often he says that his own literature, though as postmodern as it may be, he says he writes poetry, right, like Shio kaiteru. And if we look at his writings, though, in novel form, like they have a sort of rhythm, they have a lot of short sentences. So I was wondering how you see if also Fujii has written some sonnets, how do you see the sonnet evolving in contemporary Japanese literature? It's a very general question, but I'm really interested on your insight on this.
I think their works in the point is for performing. So without reading aloud, it doesn't create a certain rhythm. So performance is also a new aspect of modern Japanese poetry. The way is a bit different from Heian period, for example. It's written it used to be more written and then performed, but different way. So in the point, Tanikawa Shuntaro's and Fujii Teiba's, their poetry has certain rhythm, and we have to read aloud. And they have their own recording too. So we have to listen to how to create the performance. Is that satisfactory to you?
Yes, and I think you really struck a very important point, which I believe is really crucial in Japanese literature at all in recent times. Like many writers have been giving readings even abroad, that so they even people that write prose like are internalizing this sort of not gaze, but maybe hearing. I mean, if we think of Furukawa Hido, but even Ito Hiromi, she has been giving more and more readings of her poetry, more and more, getting more and more skilled at this, even with Jeffrey Angle. So definitely performance in poetry and literature seems to be a key and growing aspect in contemporary Japanese literature, I would argue. So thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? Okay, then I will ask something to Taneda Sensei.
Okay.
So thank you for your presentation on Ito Hiromi. It's important that we have more and more research done on her. So my question is very general. I haven't read Togenuki, but I've read other things by her. Watashi wa Anju Himeko de Aru and Kanoko Goroshi. So my question probably is very plain, but I was wondering, since you mentioned that even in Togenuki we have a recuperation of the voice of classics and other works. So I was wondering what your view is on the fact that Ito often talks of herself as a shaman.
You and Jeffrey Angles wrote Ito Hiromi as a poet, as a shamanic qualities. I understand, but Atogami Shiro at Kyushu University's professor, he says very important things. We sticks to Ito's work, in her women's body in Japanese. So 私たちは伊藤博美の女性身体というものにあまりにもこだわりすぎてきたということを最近言っておられます。それで私はそれに非常に共感をし、そしてもちろんそういうふうに振る舞ってきたというポイントは、かのこ殺し、あるいは私は安女姫子である、あるいは、エトセトラですね。つまり、チルドレンエクスペリエンスとか、ペアレンティングエクスペリエンスとか、そういうエイダリーケアですね。で、そういうことからもう一つ、その伊藤の例えば今日挙げたような草木、要するにプラントについての、思想ですかね、とか、そしてもう一つ、やっぱりその生き物として個体であるということに、こだわるということでは、やはりその動物っていう問題が、今の思想のメインストリームにかなりなってきているわけで、その両方をこの例えばトゲ抜きなり、河原アレクサなりに見ることはできないだろうかっていうふうに考えているんです。はい。 ですから、一つは彼女のこうシャーマニックなっていうのは一つの何ですかね、まあ、レジェンドというか、なんかそういうものになってきている。でもそれは多分彼女はそろそろ出しようとしているという気がいたしますが、お答えになっているでしょうか。
はい、完璧に。ありがとうございます。
はい。その
どうぞ。
コメントが質問ではないんですけど、
はい。
確かにすみません、犬が吠えてる。なんかその多分時代、シャーマニックなというか、身体に関してすごくその依拠しすぎているっていうのは、多分時代もあるのかなと思います。イルメラさんのお書きになった女流砲弾の最後の方に、伊藤さんがこの80年代にやっぱり彼女が現代史のところに出てこれたというのはやはりそのオーディエンスがそういうものを生理のこととか子供のこととかそういうのをそういうことを書くことで分断というかリテラリーフィールドに出てこれたということでやはりやっぱりオーディエンスというかパブリケーションとかプラットフォームのことを考えるとそういうことを意図的にやっていたっていうことなんていうか、すごく思い出しました。
はい。はい。私もそうだと思います。80年代の女性誌の機種として、まあ、本当は彼女は詩人にはなりたかったけれど、女性詩人になりたかったわけではないと言いつつも、もちろん女性であるわけですから、そのような、中で、まあ、やってきたっていう、その流れはもう当然あると思います。同意します。はい。
はい。他に何かフロアからありますでしょうか。
もし差し支えなかったら、J-POP の曲をちょっとだけかけてみてもいいですか？ちょっとなんかね、日本語のリズムの捉え方がもう全然違うなと思って、ちょっと衝撃を受けたんですけれども、むしろ少しだけかけさせていただいて構いません？
はい、どうぞ。
今は2月たったそれだけ辺りにはもう春が聞こえているだけでたったそれだけ昔昔の約束はもう残らない今は二月があった一度だけ夢の中にささやいて人はいないトゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥントゥン 私のために微笑んだ。花がまた開くだろう。そして鳥は変わらずに泣いて人々の春の中に入れカラスなど今はいつゆ君をに続いた私の見慣れた足跡それだけたったそれだけ私には
Thank you. Yeah, I think what also coming up, emerging from this panel is also if we have talked a lot about, in your presentation, you have talked about also, music and boundaries, also going to Ito Hiromi too, but other poets. So that in a way, also poetry through the form and bordering into performance, and also different boundaries of nature is transversing boundaries in a way between form, but also, let's say, biological realms. So we talked a lot about Ekkyo-bungaku in terms of languages and culture, but I'm also toying with ideas of, I don't know, Ekkyo Nota or transgressive poetry. And I think this aspect of sound and performance are also very important, even in the fruition of work. So in classes, I also tell students, especially when we're translating from Japanese, that also try to read and listen to how it would sound. It would also help you and give a rhythm, which I think is also something, at least something that I like to do. And hopefully there is something there to look at how the sound, the performance, even in your own personal studio, to go back to what somebody in a panel was saying yesterday, is adding to these things. I think we have a question from the floor, from Higaya Mihoko to Taneda-san. Would you explain further the relationship between plant Iegatari women and animal Waregatari men?
Thank you very much for your good question. I predicted this type of question. Yes, そうですね。まず、家語り、ノベルジャンルとか、それから我語りノベルジャンルっていうことを、亀井秀夫は、明確に、規定し、あるいは展開しているわけではないけれども、例えば我語りの方で言うと、なんだっけな、我語り、国語り、じゃあ村語り、国語りですね。そういう、序列が出来上がっていくっていうオーダーが出来上がっていくっていうふうに言ってるわけですね。それで、我語りというのは、例えば当祖の家のお種のように、いろんな話を、情報を集めて、また、人に語り、そして自分の家の来歴を語るっていう。例えばそれが、日輪の翼の、ロジーですから、ちょっと話は別ですけれども、なんか、老婆たちがですね、こちゃこちゃロジーのことを、語っているっていう、そのある種の取り留めのなさっていうものが、逆に、その語り、要するにナラティブっていうものの戦略になるんじゃないかっていうふうに、私は考えて、そして、ちょっと強引ですけれども、そのごめんなさい、家語りが、この、仮に、トゲ抜きの場合の非常に、アンチカノンですね、のタイプ。つまり、エウリピデスであろうが、山口百恵の歌であろうが、植木等であろうが、全部、その吸収して、そして、声を借りましたと語ってしまうっていう、そこにつなげられるんじゃないかっていうふうに思っています。それが一つです。それから、アニマルのところは、難しいんですけれども、伊藤がですね、例えば、河原アレクサでも、動物が死んでいくっていうか、そういうことは結構書いてるんですが、私が今考えてるところで言いますと、草木、草花、プランツそのものも、かなり獰猛な要素は持っているわけですね。蘭の花とか、それは伊藤聖子、このザ・ガーデナーのモデルになっている聖子が、なんかも言ってるんですけれども、ある意味、その動物的な獰猛さっていうのを持っているっていうことです。ですから、今後は、その伊藤における動物性と動物の問題と、それからプラントの問題っていうのは、私は多分、非常に重なるだろうとは思っているんですが、それはもう少し厳密にリサーチしないといけないなというところです。このあたりの答えでよろしいでしょうか、日賀先生。 Thank you very much.
はい、少しだけ私からちょっと質問に付け加えたいところがありますけど、割り語りという言葉は非常に興味深いと思いますけれども、でもそれは単語とかなんか表彰としての歴史とかなんかそれについてもちょっと少しだけ詳しく教えていただければ。
はい、それがですね、ここに今回出した亀井秀夫の、言葉というのは座談会の中でやっぱり自分を語るという主題ですね。だからその問題としては、私小説っていうものもあるんですけれども、日本文学の中で、私を語る、それからそれが、何ですかね、その人の人生とか、あるいは全部そういった背景も含めて全部語ることによって、なんか人々も納得するというような傾向について、確か、なんだっけな、鈴木富さんが書かれたですね、本、あたりが発端となって、そういう、いろんな、話題が出て、そして、亀井秀夫っていうのは、その大江健三郎的な、ある種のその、コスモスっていうか、そういう世界とね、もう一つそこに、抑圧という言葉はあんまり使いたくないんですが、ちょっとマージナルな方向に置いておかれているような、例えば家という作品のお種の語りっていうものを何か救い出したいっていう意図がどうもあるように思います。ただ彼自身はそれ以上展開はしていないです。
はい。じゃあちょっと、そうですね、一言で言えば自分の当たりのをすくい上げて、それをちょっと表に浮上させるという行為に近いかな。
そうですね。
わかりました。ありがとうございます。Okay, so we have some thank you comments from the chat. Does anybody have any more questions?
私から高橋先生にちょっと伺ってもいいですか？はい。
はい、どうぞ。
はい。You refer to 世界文学、1948 is interesting for me. Please, one more explain, please, this journal. 世界
文学 No, I just got the article from that.
Yes.
That's how can I say? At that time, I think it's also an influential magazine, but of let's say powerful literary figures. And then looking, they after the World War II, of course, they tried to be kind of westernized in many ways. So that magazine is a great source of information of world literature. And also they look at themselves through the way of thinking showed expressed in that magazine. So in that point, people are really keen on what was written in the magazines, and then also quite influential. That's why Nakamura decided to quit the movement by the criticism.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any comments or questions? Okay, so I see no comments in the chat. So I think that we may as well wrap up here. So again, on behalf of the Modern Literature Section conveners, thank you very much to Taneda Wakako and Takahashi Miho for their great presentations that also allowed for stimulating discussions and things that we will hopefully carry over to our own future thinkings and musings. And so if people have other questions they want to say, of course, there are always, I think, social networking platforms on Wonder between the sessions. And the meeting was recorded, as you know, and it will also be available to EAJS participants. So thank you again to the presenters, to all the audience, and to Luca for the tech support that made everything smoother. And so I'll probably we'll be seeing some of you at the next modern literature section. And if not, enjoy the rest of the conference and the rest of the day or evening or night or very early morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. お疲れ様でした。
お疲れ様でした。